our responsibility and our moral obligation and ethical obligation to the individuals for whom we're processing that data in order to deliver them a service should be the thing that outweighs, and should be the thing that this kind of the fear element of the conversation we're having now should be not driving a fear about your organization. What it should be doing is going, are we actually doing the right thing?
Yeah.
Are we doing the right thing for the individual? And if we're not, then we should do, because there will be a point where the education of the individual reaches a point that organisations who are not doing it very well can't hide anymore.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Orca Pods. Today, I've got my good friend, Luke Beckley, aka Data Lord.
Thank you.
With me, and we're going to have a conversation about data and all things data.
Excellent. My favourite topic.
Yeah, I know. Now, you'll notice this is the first episode that I don't have my list of questions to ask you. I know you already know this, but I am what life calls a technology lemon. In terms of my I can barely send, or WhatsApp is probably the ilk of my skill set.
Let's not talk about the email. Email setup scenario, that was fun for a few days.
There you go. So I'm very much going to need to be guided by you on this. All jokes aside,
yep, this
is actually a massive, I guess, arena now with the introduction of AI. Certainly for us as umbrella companies and as Orca Pay Group, and the support that you've already given us in terms of data, I really wanted to sort of just, I guess, understand first and foremost the size and the scope and where things have almost changed from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and really understand what it is that we need to be doing going forward as businesses to protect ourselves. Like I say, you're going to have to help me out.
Wow. Okay, that's a big question.
Is it?
Well, yeah. I mean, because the one thing that's happened over the last sort of 5 years, what we are now, 6 years, we had a huge regulation introduced, right? General Data Protection Regulation, 2018. Obviously, we exited from the EU, but a version of GDPR still exists. The UK GDPR is in operation, obviously in alignment with the Data Protection Act of 2018, which set a whole heap of additional requirements on businesses in the way that they process personal data. And so those obligations obviously need to be kind of carried through and maintained in order that that data gets protected in the right way and processed in the right way and for the right purposes. So, but before that, we've had data protection and other forms of regulation in the way that data is collected and processed way before that. So, Data Protection Acts prior to that have been in force. It's just that the thing that changed was the level of fining that could be attributed to any form of kind of infringement of that regulation. So suddenly that's why companies stood up and started to think about it in late 2017, 2018. So
GDPR put a far higher responsibility on those of us that are responsible for processing data.
Yeah, absolutely. And it unified the approach to it across Europe as well. So it is kind of like, people talk about it as being the standard. Yeah. Lots of other countries, about 160 countries, have got their own form of data protection, regulations and laws that need to be adhered to. So the way that we process personal data, with the way that we collect it, the way that we use it, the safeguards that we need to put in place around our use of it have all kind of been enhanced by this kind of wave of privacy and data protection adoption and regulation across the globe. We could talk about the States separately at some point, but that's kind of been the game changer. Okay. Now, the fining element was used as a stick at the very start, so as it was when the GDPR was introduced and we're still in Europe, 4% of global turnover or 20 million euros, whichever's the greater, was the potential fine amount, depending. And obviously, in order to attract that kind of thing, you'd have to be horrendously bad at all of your data protection practices
Right.
in doing that. So I don't think anybody's ever been fined that amount, apart from some of the bigger tech companies like Facebook, Google. They've all had quite substantial fines in relation to how they've gone about some of their data protection practices. But in the main, yeah, we haven't had any fines like that in the UK.
Right. I need to take a breath because you've literally said all of that, and I'm like, holy shit, like bang, bang, bang. For someone like me that doesn't understand it in the way we have policy, like, okay, you help me do my policies for my business. So anyone that's watching, just so you know, Orca Pay Group is very, very secure. But obviously a lot of what you've just said there is almost going to sound foreign language to a lot of people. What was the difference pre-2018 to how, in its most basic terms, what was different pre-2018 to, and I know it's difficult because we're 6 years further down the line with GDPR, but forget the fines. What's the difference ultimately that businesses perhaps were doing pre-2018 that now some may still be doing or but ultimately should be doing? Or is that if I've not asked that in the right way?
Well, no, I think the fine element was the kind of the game changer in terms of making people sit up and think about their responsibilities to personal data.
Yep.
There, of course, were organisations that were operating on the previous Data Protection Acts that were doing the right things, but because the enforcement of that was not quite as consistent and didn't have quite as much potential weight in terms of what could happen to you as an organisation if you were doing things wrong. And then, of course, the uniform approach to that across Europe. So obviously one of our biggest trading partners, data flows all over the place. Now the treatment of that data in those countries when we were in the EU, and still, because, you know, now we're out of it, we still have the same regulation that we have to abide by when we're interacting with our European partners, meant that we all had to do it to the same standard.
Right.
And so that was for me, the game changer at that point in time. There's been a kind of evolution in my view that the enforcement from our regulatory body, our supervisory authority in the UK, is not as stringent or as strong as it could be.
Is that the ICO?
That's the ICO.
Yep.
And because of that, the fining element hasn't been as prevalent in the UK as I believe it could have been and should have been. And a lot in our privacy community kind of feels that it should be, in order to sort of try and clamp down on bad practice. So things like just randomly collecting data that you don't need, storing data for much longer than you actually need to store it for. So a massive over-retention problem. What's the purpose for which you've collected that data? Are you then going to use it for different purposes that you've not told people about? So there's a whole heap of things that we believe organisations should be held account for and are not necessarily being done so from the supervisor authority, and in relation to what I've just said, that kind of fining situation.
Okay, let me, from what you've said there, and again, for ease of almost a dummy's guide here. So we deal with recruitment agencies, okay? Recruitment agencies, naturally, to find candidate. Well, you've been a contractor yourself, so
Absolutely.
You know how that works.
Yeah.
So to find candidates, you'll advertise a job, for example, you might get 50 CVs, okay? Out of those 50, one of the CVs is the person that you place. So in layman's terms, from everything that you've said there, back in the day, and I did recruitment for literally 2 minutes, but I would, and this was pre-2018, I want to put that caveat on there, but I would store those 50 CVs, or they get uploaded onto a database.
Would they still be in your email account as well?
In some instances, maybe. I'm not the best person to ask that. I think for some recruiters, if you've got smaller businesses, absolutely. You know, if you can't afford a CRM or a database at that moment in time, I dare say probably. So, and that's the sort of the reason I asked this question. Are you saying now that that exposes them to data breaches or data risks? Are they, in essence, falling foul of GDPR?
Well, yeah. So there are principles of the GDPR, one of which is storage limitation, right?
Okay.
So, and data minimization. So having multiple copies of the same thing, why would you need them, right? If you've uploaded them to your database, you wouldn't need them in your email account. So it's about, there's a degree of what's best practice and how do you go about doing that? How keeping your house clean to minimize the potential impact, right?
So should you, sorry, and this again, you're educating me here. So forgive me for cutting in there, but so ideally you get the CVs, you put them on your database, you should then delete the CVs from your email. Is that right?
Well, I mean, that's the principle I would adopt because I've already got a copy of the CV then in my database. If I need to retrieve it, I've got the one copy of that CV. I don't then have it in a separate system that may or may not be vulnerable to, like you said, security incidents or data breaches. And you're then protecting the data in line with the regulation, your obligations to implement this thing called technical measures, which is effectively how do you keep that data secure?
Okay.
So kind of working those best processes and best practices into your organization just means that you're protecting your company, making sure that you're meeting your regulatory obligation against the principles and the other elements that you're required to put in place. And obviously minimizing then that risk for a security incident or someone inadvertently getting into your email account and then just taking a load of CVs, right?
So I was going to say, and that's ultimately the consequence, isn't it? And that's what you're primarily protecting against. Yes, there's the regulatory element. You said about data storage, but it's the consequential elements there. And I wanted to ask you a question before. Everything that you've just said in the first 5-10 minutes there has blown my mind. I'm not, there's no point in me sitting here and pretending to say otherwise. And I guess there's a reason that I asked you to help is because obviously you're the expert in that. Do you think businesses, and I know obviously a lot will, and certainly the larger ones, but I'm thinking more your sort of medium, small enterprises. Do you think they actually understand the reality in what you've just said in that first 10 minutes or
Probably not.
Yeah.
Right. Because even me trying to put it in sort of, in terms that will assist people's understanding is difficult because you're trying to interpret a regulation and a law and make it relevant to you as an organization and what is it that you're doing and how does that actually implicate, what's the implications to you in terms of the structures that you need to put in place, the processes that you need to adopt. And it's, it's not straightforward. You've got things that you're obligated to do, like make sure you only capture the data that you need to capture. So don't over capture data. Make sure you've told people about the purpose for which you're using it. And there are defined sets of purposes. What's the lawful basis that you're capturing under, right? So there are 6 lawful bases that you should be able to say, I have collected that data and I'm processing it under contractual obligation or consent or, for the vital interests of the individual. And all of those things combine to create a data protection kind of framework that your organization should operate under. What's the benefit of that to you? 1, it means you're meeting your regulatory obligations. 2, it's probably actually quite a set of, you've honed and have made your processes efficient in terms of the data that you're capturing. You're not overstoring data, so deleting the CVs out of email, small reduction in potential storage costs and email costs. And ultimately, the key element is you're doing the right thing for the individual for whom you're processing that data, right? So we talk about it in organization terms, but it's knowing that you're not emailing my CV around 42 different people in the organization, and now it sits in 42 different people's email accounts, and I've got no idea what their approach to data protection is. So they might just start forwarding it to, they might even start reading it and then saying, oh, have you read this about this guy? Oh, this is where they live. Oh, this is the kind of things that they've put in their CV. This is a joke. You're breaching, right, at that point. And so the impact on the individual of not doing this right should always be the focus.
Okay, so I think that's, for me, is the key part is, and I know it always boils down to us as individuals. Look, what you've just said there, like how the fuck would I even know if someone's doing that? And also, mate, I'm going to go off on a slight tangent here, but it's like now cookie policies. You know, until I spoke to you, like I didn't understand that if you just accept, I'm basically giving my permission for that website to do whatever it wants with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's collecting stuff like your browser history, your IP address, anything else that's exposed, like potentially your location data. Absolutely. So it's geolocating you, likely. So now it knows what stuff you like to look at, where you are, right? And actually pinpoint you from your device. So now it knows your device and probably a load of device information about how you've accessed that website. It may expose your email, so they could have the email address, all of that stuff, all in order to build a profile on you, primarily to sell you stuff, right? From an advertising perspective.
Yeah, they're the ones that are gaining financially.
But again, you don't know what cookies and tracking technologies on that website.
So what's the difference then? And the reason I brought that up is because hypothetically, or what you've just said hypothetically about sharing someone's CV, going to, you know, however many other people in your industry, if there is something a bit juicy on there, like, oh, actually, have you seen this? What's the actual difference between that and a cookie policy then? Why should I be more worried? I understand the cookie element. Why should I be worried if a recruitment business, and I've very much said that as an example, not because I'm alleging or saying that they're doing this as businesses, but why should I be as worried about what's happening potentially internally as what I now know to be the case if I accept all the settings anytime I go onto a website?
Well, they're two different things, actually, right? So cookies and tracking technologies are governed by the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulation.
Okay.
And in order for someone to be able to drop a cookie onto your machine, the only lawful basis for that to happen is consent, or there are some, is consent. So you need a mechanism that allows someone to give you the consent for those tracking elements, those cookies to be dropped on your machine. Problem is the consent now is the consent under the GDPR, which has got to be unambiguous, freely given, and an affirmative action, right? So this is why you've seen this massive kind of spurt and growth of these cookie controls or cookie banners in order to somehow give you as the individual the ability to freely give your consent. Now, there's very few that do that, right? Because people use dark patterns, right? First problem. So they'll go accept all in massive green and then manage cookies in a very tiny piece of wording, right? There should be a reject all button as well as an accept all. They should be the same color, right? Because that only then is that unambiguous, right? That's saying, here is your choice. The choice is don't allow us to do any tracking, or if you're happy for us to do it, go for it, click accept. But they're an equal choice. And then that obviously is the affirmative action element of that as well, because you clicking on one of those is your therefore agreeing and consenting to that action taking place or that action taking place. So that's about controlling our data that's being given out to huge advertising companies in order to try and sell us stuff. The internal element then is kind of governed by your first insight into what that company is doing with your information should be the privacy notice, right? So the two things for me should be separate. You shouldn't have a privacy notice and a cookie notice in the same thing. It's my personal opinion, but separating them out gives you provides clarity about the different types of activity that is being undertaken. The privacy notice then is that first step of transparency. It's the first port of call for me as an individual going to a recruitment company's website and finding out what they actually do with my data. So what data do they collect from me? Should list what that does. What do they do with it? Should tell me what the purpose is. How long they're going to keep it? Should tell me how long that gets kept for. And then, as minimum things.
Can I be blunt here though? How many people are going to read a privacy policy?
That's the problem. So the actual wider issue is education and understanding about what actually happens to our data.
Okay, so technically speaking, to give myself the best protection every time I go onto a website, or I should be reading every single privacy policy.
I do. That's me,
Yeah,
right? Because then I'd find another site or I'd find another recruiter. That's my personal opinion. And that's because I've kind of lived and breathed this for quite some time, and so I'm aware of the practices that happen. And so I kind of want to understand what people are going to do with my data.
Are we getting? Is the tide turning that more and more people are going down that route, or is it? I've got to be honest, man. I'm trying to fit. I couldn't tell you that I've ever read anyone's privacy policy. It's just me, Rob Sharp.
And again, that comes back to companies' approach and interpretation of the delivery of that transparency, right? I.e., what are we doing with the data? The regulation says it should be easy to read, natural language,
so easy to understand, basically.
Yeah. Exactly. Section segmented so that you can understand which bits are applicable to you and which are not applicable to you, so you can easily navigate through it. What you actually find in a lot of cases is that the privacy notice is about 11 pages long, right? Yeah. It's been run past legal departments who've then legalized it as best they can. It isn't a contract. The privacy notice is not a contract between you and that company. It's the company telling you what is happening with your data, should you provide them with it. So,
and is that what it should be?
That's what it should be.
Right.
But of course, a lot of them are written very much in a legal manner that kind of goes, we've got our asses covered. Right.
Right.
That's the next step in. The privacy notice should just be telling you what's happening with, what data is going to be collected from you if you continue to interact with that business and or that website. What's going to happen to that data? Why is it needed? What one of these lawful bases is it collected under? And obviously, what are your rights in relation to that data? So as data subjects, terrible term. As individuals, we have got rights in relation to the data that's being processed by organizations, our personal data that's being processed. So obviously you can write into a company and say, I want you to tell me all the data that you've got on me.
Yep.
I want you to correct the data if you find that once you've got copies of it that it's wrong, and a whole heap of other rights.
So I've sat here and I appreciate I look like an absolute mong. I don't dispute that. It sounds quite terrifying. So from a business, I can understand about what you've said there about they get our asses covered. But actually, the way that you've explained it there, it's probably why so many people don't look at it in, and I'm going to say with now quite clearly, the respect it. And actually, the absolute requirement, it probably needs to be looked at. And you know this, but for our guests listening or watching as well, one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on is because you understand it in a way that I don't, and you're very highly thought of. Obviously, what we do as an industry, there's been 3 or 4 scenarios of real big breaches.
Yeah.
And actually, we deal with the most sacred and personal information as umbrella companies that we can, which is we've got people's bank details to pay them, where they live. We have to do right to work checks.
So you've got passports, driving licenses, you've got identity information.
Yeah, HMRC share codes. Like in terms of if you wanted to steal someone's identity, we're probably a prime time. I know people aren't going to thank me for saying that because it's almost like I've advertised that, but it's just the reality. It's the reality, of where we are.
Yeah.
And I think hearing what you've just said there, I'm glad I've said that, because I think actually, I'm not saying as an industry, we don't take it seriously. However, there have been, like I say, there's been breaches. As a contractor, what guidance would you then give? Because I know we've got umbrella companies that aren't just subjected to GDPR, like they're based in other areas in the world, and that's where back office functions are done, or other bits and pieces, which falls outside of, if I'm right, the GDPR parameters. And now I'm sitting here.
But now you're into international transfers of data, right? So now you've still got your obligation still is to your data subjects, right? So if you are going to use companies outside of the UK jurisdiction, which was what we're predominantly talking about now, again, if you are using European companies, there's a lovely thing called an adequacy decision, which basically means that we're operating at the same level of data protection as the other countries in the EU, which you'd expect, or EEA, as you'd expect, because we basically were operating under, the European GDPR as was when we were in Europe. There are some other countries that have got particular frameworks in place or an adequacy decision. So Japan, for example. United States is an interesting one. We'll talk about that in a second. But if you were outside of jurisdiction, again, we can put links in beyond this to the list of adequate countries and those that are applicable from an equitable perspective from a data protection regulation level. So people will understand these countries are all right to kind of operate in without any additional requirements. But beyond that, then you start getting into putting in contractual agreements and arrangements with those organizations to make sure that there is some legal framework in which that data can be transferred, processed by companies, let's say in India, who currently are not an adequate country under the...
Who India aren't, are they? Or is that just an example?
At the moment.
They're not?
No.
Pakistan?
No.
Wow.
So what you then need to think about is putting things like international data transfer agreements in place, which is the UK version of the mechanism required to make sure that there's a validity and some contractual arrangement that operation in that country will adhere to and adopt the same standards of data protection under which we're operating.
Okay, so now there's a bomb gone off in my head. So we have in the payroll industry, international payroll companies that will payroll in tens, if not hundreds of different countries. We also have payroll software where cloud-based a lot. Now, contractors' information goes on our payroll software.
Yep.
And all of the information that we've spoken about. I know you have developers in India, you have developers in Pakistan. I know that from other payroll companies out there. Would they also need to be subject to the same in terms of protecting the data of our contractors, so to speak? They would need those same international agreements, not just Orca Pay Group, for example. Not that it's obviously matters to us because we don't have any facilities out there, but let's say my payroll software, for example, have their developers in India. Does that also, because they then potentially have access and do have access to that data, does that mean that international reciprocal agreement would need to be in place?
Well, yes. So the cloud software provider would likely have one, or they would have some
when you
sort of
say
data
likely have one, sorry to interrupt you, should have one.
Should have one. There should be one in place you need to work out the chain, right? So if it was you to the development team were then licensing a piece of cloud software for that data to go on, then the chain should be complete.
So it'll be us
to the developer.
Our payroll software, then you've got the developers.
Right. Okay. In which case then, so yeah, there should be one between you and the software provider.
Yeah.
And then of course there should be one, if the development team is an entity, there should be one between you and the entity. If you're directly contracting that individual through Orca, then you're into what your internal procedures are in terms of almost like employee requirements. So their acceptable use, the way that they would dial in, the data protection policy that you would have internally about how personal data should be treated and how they should look after it. So it kind of depends on that construct, but the answer is yes, the chain needs to be complete.
And we, as Orca, if it was, it's not, but if it was for the example of this, we would actually then need to understand exactly how that process works.
Yeah. And because in that scenario, if you think about, there's this understanding concept of data controller and data processor. So in this scenario, Orca is the data controller, i.e. you're the organization that is collecting the data from the individuals. And then what you're doing is effectively subcontracting elements of that processing to different organizations who specialize in payroll processing or cloud storage for CVs or the documents that you are required to maintain for, financial records, for example. Might be slightly different. There's two different things there. Your responsibility is to make sure that chain is complete.
Can I, as a contractor then, could someone phone me up and say, right, Rob, I want to see or know all of those processes? Do I have a legal obligation?
You not necessarily how the processes work, but you are definitely obliged via the right to be informed to, back to the privacy notice thing, about what you're doing with the data and ideally where that's being processed and why it's being processed.
Yeah,
so they could write in and ask you under that right, explain to me what happens to my data and where is it being processed.
I think I've just opened Pandora's box, mate.
You might have done.
Yeah. Because in my head now as well, like we have to, so HMRC demand payroll companies keep information for X period of time. Yep. And we are legally required to do that.
Yep. So
the importance of what you've just said there now, and that's, sorry, as you're educating me, that's why now sparks
I can see it all happening,
because now I'm thinking, shit, man, like, okay, so we've got to keep that for 6 years. Like, actually, that puts an even greater responsibility on us to ensure that, because again, that is national insurance number, bank details, potentially a passport, a driving license, a telephone number, an email address, your residential address. Like, there's 7 things. I mean, that's basically, you give me those 7 things now, I can go and be Luke Beckley tomorrow.
You could have bought me a house that I didn't know about.
Fuck. So, that's what I mean. So like, it's not just, okay, after a year, we'll demolish that data.
No.
Like, we have a period of time that we have to keep it.
Correct. Yeah. And of course, processing it for that legal obligation is absolutely, you meeting your GDPR obligation in terms of storage, right?
Yep.
But your responsibility is, how do I store that? And how do I make sure that's stored securely?
Yeah.
And can I make sure that I can get access to it? And how can I, if someone writes in and says, I want copies of all my data, that you know where it is and you can access it quickly and easily, and it's secure. And we're talking on the scary side of it, right? And we need to be, we will move into a more positive scenario shortly. But I think what we're talking about is the individual. And I think that's what's actually making me quite happy about this conversation is that we've immediately dismissed this whole, or you as an organization are going to get fined 4% of your global turnover or 20 million euros, whichever's the biggest. And you're going to, where you're going to find that money, and that could take you out of business. The likelihood of that is only true if your practices are so bad and you kind of repeat offend, that you would end up with a massive fine. What we're talking about here is our responsibility and our moral obligation and ethical obligation to the individuals for whom we're processing that data in order to deliver them a service should be the thing that outweighs, and should be the thing that this kind of the fear element of the conversation we're having now should be not driving a fear about your organization. What it should be doing is going, are we actually doing the right thing?
Yeah.
Right? Are we doing the right thing for the individual? And if we're not, then we should do, because there will be a point where the education of the individual reaches a point that organizations who are not doing it very well can't hide anymore.
I get, but I'm sitting here. I don't think we've ever been asked a question like that ever.
Well,
not that I mind.
Not that you know,
but
and again, not particularly. But again,
they may have done.
You may have done, and that's
but our
another
processes
thing.
are right. So, and in terms of when and if that happens, that information, I mean, it is secure. Obviously, you've helped us do that. Do you know what it is? It's more the fear that I have because of what information, not just Orca, but our industry keeps.
Yeah.
It's really, and that's why I think, look, I don't give a shit. People can try to convince me otherwise, but we live in the era of Big Brother now. We do.
UK is the most surveilled country in the world, right?
Yeah. And so now that you don't just now have the surveillance, but you also have like what we were saying about the cookie elements, for example. Yeah. And I guess the easiest way, you and I have had a conversation about this, obviously off camera, where he's like talking for like an hour and 40 minutes.
Yeah.
But we're giving our image rights away.
Oh, image rights, access to our data, access to our location, the ability to build a profile on us that allows advertisers to stick adverts into any of our devices these days. You look at your email accounts, nothing's for free, right?
Yeah.
So your trade-off is elements of your personal data in order to build these profiles on you that can then be used to sell that data onto advertisers and or marketing companies, and then, try and get you to, I'm going to say this, the most harmless way, buy more product, right? But of course, those profiles exist because you might have liked certain political standpoints, right? And so suddenly you've got a political persuasion that's part of the demographic that organizations may want to say, okay, so this demographic, if we present this type of content, are likely to sway in a particular direction.
And then that feeds to so many different other avenues, social media.
And then. And I think that's one of the biggest kind of shortfalls and the biggest education points that we in the data protection community are kind of desperately trying to get across, which is it's not contained in a singular kind of like situation. There are risks and consequences that come out of collecting what you think is innocuous data, right? So you have to think beyond, I'm doing it so that I can meet my obligation to pay someone, right? But okay, that's fantastic. But now why have you got, I'm not suggesting you have, you general have got multiple copies of their driving license or their passport sat in an email account or sat in a folder on someone's laptop, and then you've got another copy of it actually stored properly. But what have you done about the other 2 or 3 copies? Well, probably nothing, because you don't think that there's ever going to be a problem.
And that's, and you've probably teed that up perfectly, because look, it terrifies, I'm not going to lie, it terrifies me because of how readily available data is now. I think what also terrifies me is we live in a reality now, in a world now where people are trying to penetrate businesses minute in, minute out of each and every single day to specifically obtain that data.
Yeah.
And it's what I call data warfare. Principally, that is what it is. I don't think that and it's one of the reasons I wanted to get you on, I know that people are going to sit here and be like, shut up, you two. Like, it's not that important. Mate, genuinely. But actually, everything that you've just explained in the first 30 minutes, it makes me understand that I'm right to be terrified. Now, that's a good thing because we go above and beyond in terms of I know if someone's going to get in and you're never bulletproof, but we try to make ourselves as bulletproof as possible. Obviously,
and that's the best you can do.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I can't remember what there was a conversation or a statistic. It's not a statistic as such about like the security element of it, right? How do you protect your systems? And it was like, the difference is the information, like trying to protect your boundaries is being done within the confines of the law, right? And the regulations that govern how you implement these things. For those who want access to the data, there is no law, right? Yeah. So they're always one step ahead. So we're always in catch up in order to try and, from a security perspective, protect people getting access to our systems and to our data. But actually, humans are the problem, right? So we are the weak link, and it'll be things like social engineering. It'll be like clicking on the wrong email. It'll be like someone tailgating you into an office. It'll be something not like that. It seems like part of your everyday that then results in the data loss.
And I think talking about consequences is a must. I mean, I bring it back to, we had, so 3 that I know existed in our industry. Mm-hmm. I'm not speaking factually here, but it cost like brand reputation and reputation damage. People had literally started putting on the internet that their information had been found on the dark web. Yep. People had credit problems with credit files. Yep. Obviously, there was an absolute like barrage of people when these breaches happened. I think one was literally got in because password was password. That could be an industry rumor and bullshit. But I've seen the reality and the consequences of when that happens. And you said earlier, like, we don't ever think it's going to happen to us until it happens to us.
Exactly.
The education part is the key. There's a lot of similarities in what you do to what we do. Yep. People exploiting or able to find what are deemed loopholes. Yep. To, I'll call it cheating or unethical, immoral behaviour, in some instance criminality, is all for that extra pound, that extra £2, that extra piece of data. Question: do you think that the mentality of private sector is at the point yet where we could potentially walk into an absolute fuck off Armageddon? And I know people are going to go, Jesus, Rob, like, talk about the Grim Reaper there, but I don't know, mate, in my opinion, like, and I'm very, very minuscule, I get that, but I don't know, you've sort of really highlighted that this is something that we probably need a lot more education on and understanding the nuances of it, because actually the reality of what the consequences could be are potentially fatal.
Well, yeah, we can, and we talked about that just people before we got on air and started recording, and there are lots of small organizations out there, charities, social enterprises doing incredible work, but for some of the darkest circumstances, right? So we talk about knife crime, we talk about domestic violence, right? And yet they don't have the resources that a lot of the private, like we have, right? Yep.
Well, I have thanks to you, sir.
Well, exactly. But and like you said, in terms of the private sector, size and scale, right? Some organizations have got massive data protection teams, privacy teams, information security teams. But of course, those smaller organizations who are dealing with those types of things are actually dealing with the most sensitive data, right? So let's take that domestic violence one, right? Someone is trying to help victims of domestic violence. They have come to them. There's a service that they're offering. They're offering them some form of shelter, some sort of protection from the situation that they have, been managed to escape from. So now they've got why that person's there, who that person is, probably where their current location is, so that they can ensure that that information is flowing towards that, that they are looking after them and providing that service to them properly. Are they storing that data properly? Now, I know a lot of them will be, I'm not suggesting that this is a rife situation. This is an example of a potential issue that could occur by not protecting that data properly. I don't need to spell out what the potential consequences are of losing that data if you've not got it stored securely and it's just on a spreadsheet and it's on your laptop and you lose your laptop. And the consequences are severe.
Well, in that instance, that genuinely could be fatal. Right? Because if you've got the name of, let's say, and again, as an example here, someone who is a paedophile or someone who is, has been beating up their spouse or their partner.
Yep. Yeah.
Fuck.
But so that's
the worst case scenario.
And so those are extreme examples of not adopting good data protection practice, right? And so I kind of want to get to the point where we're saying it's actually not that complicated, because the regulations and the laws are, everyone's opinion and view of regulation and law is it's restrictive, right? It's there to prevent us some people look at it as it's trying to keep boundaries and guidelines and that therefore we keep a civil society. Others look at it as a preventative thing, right? And the UK GDPR and all the other regulations under which kind of data protection is governed can seem kind of overwhelming, but they're actually great foundations for good data protection practice. And your point earlier was really interesting, right? Because your whole ethos is no fucking about. We're going to make sure that we are transparent with you about what you are getting paid and how we go about paying you, right? So that suddenly is and you will not swerve or divert from that because that is your ethos and what you're about. The principle is the same for data protection. If you're wanting to provide that individual security and belief in your organization, then just take a look at the principles and think about them as building blocks, right? Think about them as ways to improve your practices in the way that you process that and hold and store and use that personal data of the individuals for which you are servicing. And actually, you then see it in a totally different light because it's not complicated. There are, as there are with all regulations, right? You've got to hold data for a certain amount of time. You've got to pay the tax elements in a certain time frame, the legal obligations, all around that. Same things about how you implement these practices. But again, they're not that complicated. And now it's easy for me to sit here and say that, having done it multiple times, right? And I know that it's not. But that's why I'm kind of here saying, speak to people like me, and they'll tell you that it isn't complicated. There are lots of things to do that you will require a person like me to help get in place for you and in order to continue managing. But, that's why you have experts in fields. Yeah. Just like you have, payroll experts, right? Yeah. I have no idea how I just go, Rob, sort this out for me, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But and that's because it's interesting because obviously you come with a contractor hat as well. And I think it's probably, COVID made us a society almost a little bit lazier, didn't it? We couldn't go out.
Yep.
Everything can now be delivered to your door if you want to take away.
Yep.
We
all went online.
Yeah, mate, we're online.
But we all had to work online. So imagine the risk that suddenly posed, right? Security risks, people trying to spin up ability to get their organizations to work remotely.
Yeah.
And it's all, so far so good worked out. But
so what would you say? So if you're a contractor, or I'll tell you what, if you're a recruiter that works with a payroll company, if you're the actual end client that works with that recruiter who then works with Orca, like there's obligations actually, isn't there, from right to the top, whoever that person is going to work for, to the recruitment agency who sourced and placed them, to Orca who's then payrolling them.
Yep. In all those instances, you're collecting different sets of personal data, over which you've got obligations to meet the regulation, look after that data, protect it, use it for the purposes that you've set out to collect it, and then make sure that you don't over-collect the data, don't store it for longer than you need. There's all these things that sound really complicated, but are not if you just put some simple practices in place and should that be being asked then? So we talk a lot about supply chain compliance, and like recruitment agencies, they have to be able to demonstrate you've put a reasonable procedure in place, in essence, to have taken reasonable care that your supply chain is compliant. And that goes right to the hiring client as well. Is there principally the same? So we do that with SafeRec now. So we send full audit reports and due diligence reports on a month-by-month basis that can then be filtered down the supply chain, big tick, reasonable care has been taken, and you have a reasonable procedure in place. Should the same principle, in essence, I'm not saying every single month, the requirement to do that, maybe you'll tell me otherwise, but should there be something that, so we'll get an annual, so we get questionnaires, for example. So whenever that annual agreement has run out, we get another one saying, right, we need you to provide A, B, C, D, and E. Now, I've filled out enough of these in my time to know that privacy policies, how do you manage data, all of these things that you've spoken about do not appear on there. We're not requested and we're not asked to provide that. Right.
Some may, I'm not going to lie, but I can never ever recall having to attach our privacy policy. Now, ours are online, so potentially they can just go and get them and not necessarily ask us. But should that be asked from us?
My personal opinion is I would love that happened.
Legally, does it need to be asked for? No.
Okay,
so then that's why it's not.
And that's why it's not there. But there's the difference, right?
Right.
There's how, for me, companies differentiate themselves, right? By doing the right thing.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
As opposed to what I have to do. And that's why there's still, back to the education piece, to get companies away from looking at the GDPR and any other data protection obligations that they've got as a tick box exercise, because it ultimately isn't, right? You're talking about holding my financial data is in your hands, right? And who I have this, your privacy notice tells me how you go about doing it. I have to trust that that's the case as an individual. From an organizational perspective, if you're just doing the minimum, then are those two things aligned? Are you actually telling me what you're doing, and are you actually really doing it? I'm assuming you are, but then where's your moral compass in that process if you're not legally obliged to provide a copy of your internal privacy policy? So how you're making your employees deal with data, as an example, one that you raised earlier, right? If no one's checking, then...
And that's the point,
then,
right?
Then you again, back to the whole people do the minimum requirement and get away with things.
It blows my mind, mate. I just, but it's, I understand that though. And you said like morality and ethics, and they're two words that we use very, very frequently and regularly in our industry. And when you have the lack of that, then you're able to exploit, you're able to cut corners. And we've seen the reality of what that's meant in our industry, certainly. Look, I'm conscious that obviously we've...
If we talk to you again.
Mate, we've gone long already. I want to speak to you about AI and the impact that AI in its different guises and the potential risk that certainly OpenAI. I think, again, thankfully, as you'll well know, is it Chat GPT?
Yeah.
Right. I couldn't get it right, could I?
No, that was perfect.
Was that the right?
Well done.
Right. Yeah. So I think I was steered to it once. I loathe AI because I think, so I did it once on LinkedIn. Well, I did I told you, didn't I?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I read it and it was about England just before the Euros or something. And I hated it. And I was like, that's not me. And a lot of people had said to me, like, you can tell that wasn't you. You've got a specific way of writing. I'm not sure that was a compliment either.
Yeah, this output was so grammatically correct, Rob. I'm very impressed, which made me realise it wasn't you.
Your spelling's right. But actually, when I spoke to you about AI, and I want to be careful here because there's a lot of AI products that are good, and we use one, SafeRec, and that's proprietary, that's purpose-built, it's protected. But you alarmed the shit out of me with OpenAI and actually the risks. And I think, I'm seeing people put, to do a logo redesign, put in some form of AI to rewrite a CV. Now, I know about rewriting CVs because I've spoken to enough recruiters into OpenAI. And I just wanted for you to give us, as I know you can't keep it short, but the reality of how OpenAI works and the dangers to data, to individuals, to businesses with having this. It's almost like we've been brainwashed a little bit with OpenAI, isn't it?
Well, they basically mass introduced or introduced mass use of generative AI, right? Which is this next gen where it creates new content. So there's a variety of different models, for want of a better term, types of AI, lots of them right down from narrow, just doing very basic functions, all the way up to these large language models, which again are just massive algorithms processing lots and lots of data in a particular way and retrieving results and providing you information back from already defined and existing content. And then, of course, you've got that next step, which is make me an avatar in the style of me as a Viking, right? Yeah. And then suddenly you've got a brand new kind of image. And so those models, particularly that model, I need to be a bit careful because obviously OpenAI is the company. ChatGPT and the variations of its outputs are its tools.
Okay. But they got
effectively scraped the web, right? They basically scraped the web and built a model based off as much data as they could consume up to a particular point in time, right? Now, there's a whole heap of conversation and potential litigation going on about the validity of that in terms of regulation and whether that, them trying to claim it's publicly available. Well, I might have posted some pictures on Facebook for my friends to see, but I certainly didn't post them on Facebook for a company to go and scrape those images and stick them into its training model and its data set for people to then be able to either find those images or then use those images to create a profile or type of profile of individuals that then give that request that you make to the ChatGPT a particular style of output, right? I didn't even know that had happened, right? And I'm not suggesting I found that, but that's how they built their model.
Yeah.
And so, we talked about that particular example. I won't name the individual, but I know that he's taken umbrage in a very particular way with OpenAI because came out, thought, test it. Who am I, right? Individual's name. Came back, told him he died in 2019, right?
I can't fucking believe that.
And he was like, what? So queried it a little bit more. And then because of the generative element of it, what it did was create effectively links to fake obituaries to tell him to justify the output.
Basically saying why it was right.
Right? Why it was right. So there are inherent risks in in certain models and certain kind of AI applications.
So if let's say I put my payslip in there, for example.
Yeah, I would never recommend you do that.
No, obviously I'm not going to. But okay, better still then, we mention this because I know this. I've got lots of friends who tell me this, that they go in and they will say, and actually I'll nick your example, what you said before we came on camera, but they will upload a CV and say, right, chat
GPT.
Write me in the form of this CV, rewrite in the form of Shakespeare.
Yep.
What's the damage that that's doing every time someone uploads? Obviously, you've just said, so the data then goes onto the web and into that void or that space.
So yeah, you've already then published your data directly, that level of data into a huge model that has now got access from pretty much everybody in the world, right? So there's that. Then it's being used to form and create profiles probably about you. So it's connected to your interaction with the model. So it knows that obviously that was your data set that you've uploaded. But it then makes it available to anybody to prompt it, right? Search the details.
Criminals that are looking to obtain data, does that just make their job easier?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, without doubt. And that's why you need to think about, there was a point where there was no controls on that particular AI application. They've now introduced paid versions of the model and the ability to determine whether you want your data to be used as part of the training model or not.
Right.
So they have put privacy controls in place, but again, if you've paid,
how much damage has already been done
for the version, but how much damage has already been done.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, prior to that, the way that data model particularly was collected, there's lots of conversation going on about the validity of it right now. And so if you're looking at AI applications, a sort of a tiny plug here. So I am kind of part of another organization, Smooth AI, where we're trying to. So Jerry, Sam, plug in. We are trying to give both sides of that story. So just for clarity, I'm a technology person, right? I love tech. I'm a bit of a geek, but that needs to be counterbalanced with doing it in the right way. Back to the ethical use, the morality of it, and application of law and legislation to protect us as individuals. And so as part of Smooth AI, what we're trying to do is find tools that can help businesses improve their processing, the services that they provide, kind of drive efficiency in those processes, and then kind of give a rain check on, like a validity check on, well, are they doing the right things from a data protection perspective? Is their approach to data protection giving me sufficient confidence that they actually do give a shit about the personal data that I'm going to upload into their model? What are they going to do with that data? Who do they share that with? Do they actually give me the ability to control whether I, feed it into the data set for training purposes or not? Those types of things. So for us, it's doing that other side of the check. It's not just rushing headlong into using any AI application and just, piling a load of data of your personal data into it, or your business data, right? Yeah. So the IP problem is still the same thing. And there's a really famous case. A large Asian electronic manufacturer, when ChatGPT first kind of burst onto the scene, uploaded a load of proprietary code about one of the products that they were developing, and suddenly found that a load of their competitors had access to all this proprietary code that was going to be for a brand new product. Game over, right?
Yeah, because they're fucked,
so product's gone, and then it's gone. Yeah. You can't retrieve it because it's then part of a very complex setup and model that is almost impossible to unpick, right? So, AI will absolutely create huge amount of opportunity, help drive efficiencies, make things and certain tasks much quicker as basic principles of what it can deliver. And obviously, but the other side of that coin is what is the cost of that from a personal data perspective? What are we going to lose or have to give away in order for us to embrace those efficiencies, that enhancement, the ability to do things slightly quicker. And that's why you kind of really need to check what the application provider is doing with that personal data, and how are they building their models, and how are they training their models? Because there's an ethics requirement there, right? There's an ethics and an output requirement. And that is, if you don't understand where that data originated, then do you understand the biases that may be inherent in that data set for which that model is built on? So you might start getting outputs that are skewed against a particular demographic or a particular, persuasion. That's horrendous, but beyond your control. And so that's why it's really, really important to kind of dig into the tool you're going to use. Where does that data come from? And what data are you going to have to effectively give away in order to reap the benefit from it?
I think that's
a whole nother podcast.
I was just about to say, we haven't even spoken about social media yet either.
No.
And being honest, I don't think we're going to have to start anyway, biggest serial killer in the world.
Anytime for you.
Yeah. I've been sat here pretty much with my mouth open for the whole episode. I think a lot of people are going to also appreciate that I basically said nothing either. Mate, you've opened my look. I'm very fortunate that I get to call on you and your expertise. I think we're coming to the end now, but two things. What would the one bit of advice be that you would give to businesses now that are looking and maybe, would listen to this and think, we are the ones that are just the tick box exercise. We do want to use AI to, streamline some of our processes and perceived to become more efficient. What would be or better still, is it have a conversation with you? Like,
well, I'm always open for conversation. As you can tell, I talk almost as much as Rob. So this is a weird scenario, but it's great. And I think find me on LinkedIn. Happy to have a conversation. We can put that in the notes. You asked two questions there, and I'm going to answer both of them. The first one, for those that think they're just doing a tick box exercise, I think the key is, how do you want to differentiate yourself? Because for me, it's a differentiator, right? I think particularly if you're a contractor, I would be looking at, how do people process my data and do they really give a shit about what they're doing with it? If I can be confident that they're not spraying my CV around everywhere, they're not spraying, any of my financial details all over the place, I think that becomes a differentiator for you as an organization.
100%.
And I think your narrative changes about, I'm going to bring it back to something else that we're involved in, but it being a personal thing, right? If you show that you care, the current data protection regulations and legislation is a massive enabler for that. It's huge if you just embrace the principles and understanding how to collect data properly and understand how to give people access to that data. I think you set yourself apart as an organization. That's the first one. If you're looking to introduce AI into your organization, research the provider of that AI tool thoroughly and look at what you might have to give away in order to reap the benefit. You've got to make a judgment call, do a risk assessment on it, and just determine whether it's going to be too much of a cost.
Yeah. And that's something you could help.
Oh, absolutely.
Business with.
Yeah.
Because you've got quite a few different hats, haven't you?
I've got quite a few different hats.
The only guest that I didn't introduce you, Luke Beckley, because you're so skilled.
Well, yes, very kind. Thank you very much. No, I've got a few different things that I'm involved in and hats, but one of them is obviously trying to help organizations get their head around this stuff and do the right thing and implement it to be that differentiator.
Do you know what? Where it started quite scary is probably a nice way to bring it full circle into a close. Actually, the longer we've spoken in the second half of this, the more gentle it's become, if that makes sense. It's not this big, scary, like, I've got a ghoul in my closet. And I think that's probably the key part there, isn't it? Is
Absolutely.
that actually you can help make something almost seem a little bit like, don't want to fucking touch that.
Yeah.
To actually, let's do it together, let's educate, and let's make this something that becomes a seamless process for you.
Absolutely.
But ultimately protects your business.
Yeah. There we go.
Mate, you're a legend.
That
Is the quickest podcast I think we've done. Now, before you go, I've got a very special gift for you.
Okay.
I do have to send a caveat to all my other guests. You will get something like this as well. I didn't have it in time, obviously, when
I'm
we
a little bit
first
nervous
spoke.
now, but yeah.
No,
All
it's
right.
not a naked picture of me, buddy.
In which case
this
I'm
is
out.
just a little gift. So it is
Oh,
an
man.
Orca Pods branded.
Thank you
might
very
have seen
much.
my hoodie.
I'm going to just
for
move
yourself.
my mic.
Yeah, that's all right.
Thank you very much indeed.
To say thank you for coming on. Now that's going to need to be worn and posted on LinkedIn.
Understood.
If the size is not correct, let me know and I'll get you the correct one.
And it might just be a headshot.
just to hang it up.
And I'll lift the logo up. Yeah.
But mate, just wanted to say genuinely thanks very much.
An absolute pleasure as always.
That, like I say, has been the quickest I've ever done. I'm sorry that I was a little bit blown away in the beginning, but
It's all right.
look, I'll work with you. I know your ability in terms of what we do as an umbrella industry.
Yep.
Like, honestly, you're, I'm just glad I know you, mate.
Vice
So,
versa.
Luke,
It's been
thanks,
awesome.
bud.
Thank you very much for
No
having me
worries.
on.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, you can follow us on YouTube, Apple and Spotify, and very much look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for joining us. Bye.